In a world ravaged by the relentless spread of the undead, there exists a small, unusual family that has learned to survive where others have failed. This family, a man named Daniel, his undead wife, Elise, and their young child, Lucas, live on the very edge of a crumbling world, a world teetering on the brink of total collapse. While most survivors are fighting to stay alive in the midst of the chaos, this family has adapted to a twisted new reality, finding a way to live with what remains of their former lives. Daniel never imagined that the day he would meet Elise would mark the beginning of his transformation, both physically and emotionally. It was just after the outbreak, a moment that felt like it happened in a heartbeat, that the woman he loved, Elise, succumbed to the virus. She died violently, torn apart by the flesh-eating creatures that had once been ordinary humans. But death wasn't the end for her. The virus didn't just claim her life, it twisted her into something far worse, something both human and not. When Daniel found Elise reanimated, an undead version of the woman he had once cherished, he almost lost hope. But love, in its most twisted form, pulled him back from despair. He couldn't bring himself to kill her. She was still his Elise, and though she now moved like a predator, there was something in her eyes, something faintly human, that made him believe she could still be saved. So he kept her close, feeding her what little he could, even though every part of his rational mind told him it was a hopeless cause. She had become a threat, a monster in every sense of the word. But love doesn't follow reason, and Daniel couldn't let her go. He watched over her, protected her, and in turn, Elise had a strange kind of loyalty to him. There were moments, fleeting, brief, that made Daniel believe she remembered who she once was. In those moments, it was like the virus hadn't fully claimed her, and there was a brief flicker of the woman he had married. Their survival depended on finding refuge in a world that was no longer safe for anyone. Daniel learned to keep a low profile, never staying in one place for too long, always moving, always staying one step ahead of the marauding zombies that roamed in packs, and the more dangerous threats, other survivors who had lost their humanity in the face of desperate circumstances. Daniel couldn't afford to make mistakes, he couldn't risk drawing attention to his undead wife. They found an abandoned house on the outskirts of a forgotten town, a crumbling structure that once stood as a symbol of normalcy. It was here that Daniel made his stand, creating a little sanctuary for his family, a place to call home. The house was falling apart, its windows boarded up, and its rooms filled with dust and decay. But to Daniel, it was perfect. It was his little world with his wife and son, a semblance of the life they once had before everything was consumed by the apocalypse. Lucas, their child, was the beacon of hope in this otherwise dark and hostile world. Though he had never known a world without the undead, he was bright-eyed, curious, and surprisingly resilient. He had inherited his mother's ability to adapt, even in the face of such overwhelming odds. Lucas was still young, but Daniel could see the spark of intelligence in his eyes, the same spark he had seen in Elise when they were young together, before the virus had stolen her from him. Elise, for her part, was more than just an undead creature. She was a protector in her own strange way. The virus had not taken everything from her. Her body might have been rotting and broken, but her instincts, her loyalty to Daniel and Lucas, remained. She had a strange, eerie grace as she moved through their little home. At night, when danger lurked outside, it was Elise who stood guard at the door, her undead senses alert to every sound, every movement, every shadow. She would growl in warning, low and guttural, but her protective nature was clear. To Daniel, she was still his wife, still the woman he had loved with all his heart. The family's days passed in a routine of survival. Daniel ventured out at dawn to scavenge for supplies, while Elise and Lucas stayed hidden, waiting. Their supplies dwindled over time, but Daniel was resourceful. He had learned how to navigate the dangerous, zombie-infested wasteland with precision. He knew where the supply runs were most likely to be safe and when to avoid certain areas where groups of raiders or zombies were more likely to be found. Every moment was a calculated risk, but for Daniel, there was no choice. He had to keep them alive, for Elise and Lucas. In a world where everyone else had turned against each other, where even families had been torn apart by the horrors of the undead, Daniel found himself clinging to the only thing that mattered, his family. Elise, his undead bride, was no longer the woman he had once known. But in his eyes, she was still his. And together, with their son Lucas, they fought to survive, one day at a time, on the edge of a dying world. Life in the post-apocalyptic world was always teetering on the edge of disaster, and for Daniel and his family, each day was a careful negotiation between survival and madness. Their isolated existence had become a strange, fragile balance of love, fear, and necessity. Daniel had grown accustomed to the tension that hung in the air, the constant reminder that one misstep could mean the end for all of them. But there were moments when the haunting beauty of their little family's bond shone through, making the weight of their unusual situation a bit more bearable. The days had become predictable. Daniel would venture into the wasteland to find food and supplies, Elise would stand watch, and Lucas, growing faster than Daniel liked, would play in the yard, unaware of the dangers that lurked beyond their tiny world. But every day also brought its share of challenges. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the horizon, Daniel returned to their small home carrying a sack of food. His face was weary, the strain of his daily survival taking its toll. He had just about reached the doorstep when he stopped, a sharp chill crawling up his spine. Something was wrong. The air felt different, heavier, as though the world itself had gone quiet in anticipation. Daniel's heart began to pound. He could hear nothing, no groans, no howls, no movement. Just the eerie stillness of the evening. But it was precisely that silence that made him uneasy. It was too quiet. The zombies had an unnatural presence, a guttural sound of life barely clinging to them, but tonight, there was nothing. A chill of dread spread across Daniel's chest. He turned toward the front door, eyes narrowing, and saw Elise standing in the threshold, her vacant gaze fixed on the distance, motionless. For all her undead traits, Elise still held on to some form of loyalty to her family. But there were moments when Daniel wondered if the virus had truly taken more from her than just her humanity. In these moments, when she stood frozen in place, her senses tuned to some unseen danger, Daniel was reminded that the woman he once knew was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous. But she was his wife, and in a twisted way, she was still the protector he had always known. "Elise?" Daniel called softly, his voice tense. She didn't respond, but her body shifted slightly, like a twitch in the air before a storm. She turned her head, meeting his gaze with those vacant eyes that once held so much love and tenderness. But now, they were just empty sockets, a faint echo of a woman he had known. "Elise," Daniel repeated, more urgently this time. A low growl rumbled from her chest, deep and throaty, like an animal sensing something beyond its reach. It was her warning. There was something out there. Something to fear. Daniel knew he had to act quickly. He reached inside his jacket, pulling out a small knife, a weapon he'd fashioned from an old, broken bottle. It wasn't much, but it was something. His heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the horizon, looking for the source of Elise's warning. It wasn't the zombies this time. This was something else. A sound, faint but growing louder, emerged from the woods beyond their home, a distant rumble that sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. It was the unmistakable sound of an engine, the mechanical growl of a vehicle. Daniel's stomach dropped. Other survivors. He cursed under his breath. The last thing he wanted was to attract unwanted attention. He knew the kind of people who survived in this world. They were ruthless, driven by their own need for survival, often at the expense of others. And they would have no mercy on a family like his, especially one with an undead wife in tow. "Lucas, get inside. Now!" Daniel barked, the urgency clear in his voice. Lucas, who had been playing with a few scavenged toys in the yard, froze at his father's command. His wide eyes looked up at Daniel, instinctively sensing the tension in the air. He nodded without a word and ran inside, disappearing behind the heavy door. Daniel's heart twisted in his chest as he watched his son disappear. He knew Lucas didn't fully understand the world they now lived in, but every time Daniel saw the boy run for cover, he was reminded that Lucas still had hope. Hope for a future that Daniel wasn't sure would ever come. Elise's growl deepened, and her stiff posture seemed to vibrate with some unseen threat. Daniel's mind raced. He had no choice but to confront whatever was out there. He turned to Elise, who had already moved toward the edge of the porch, sniffing the air like a predator ready to pounce. She may have been undead, but she still carried the instincts of a protector. Daniel stepped toward her, keeping his voice low. "Stay close, Elise." The woman he once loved gave a low moan of acknowledgement, and together they moved toward the edge of the yard. The sound of the vehicle grew louder, a harsh engine roar cutting through the quiet, but Daniel's focus was fixed on the woods ahead. The trees swayed in the wind, but he saw no movement, only the shifting shadows of the evening. And then, the first figure appeared. A silhouette, moving cautiously through the trees, its shape looming in the fading light. Daniel's grip tightened on the knife, his pulse quickening. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Elise, standing beside him, emitted a low hiss, ready to strike if necessary. As the figure drew closer, Daniel felt his stomach knot. This was no ordinary survivor. This person was moving too smoothly, too quietly. The unmistakable feeling of dread surged through him. And then he saw it, the glint of metal. A weapon. The new danger was here, and Daniel knew this fragile family's balance was about to shatter. The silhouette emerged from the darkness, its steps slow but deliberate, and as it drew closer, Daniel's heart rate spiked. He could hear the sound of the engine in the distance, still humming, but now that the figure was in full view, all his focus shifted to the person standing before him. The stranger was a man, rugged, with dark, unkempt hair and eyes hidden behind the shadow of a worn-out hood. His clothes were tattered and dirty, a sign of long days spent on the road in the apocalypse. His face, half covered by a scarf and beard, held no expression as he cautiously approached. His hand rested on the handle of a machete, long and gleaming in the low light of the setting sun. Daniel didn't move at first. His grip on the knife tightened, but he kept it by his side. Elise, however, had moved to a defensive stance beside him, her body rigid, her eyes unblinking. There was an unnatural stillness to her, a kind of predatory calm. It was a warning. The man paused just out of reach, eyes flicking from Daniel to Elise and then to the door of the house where Lucas had disappeared. He didn't seem fazed by Elise's presence, despite the obvious signs that she wasn't entirely human. In fact, there was something almost familiar in his gaze, a recognition, a hint of understanding, that sent a ripple of unease through Daniel. "You've got yourself a bit of a family situation," the man said, his voice rough but steady. "Didn't think I'd see something like this out here." Daniel's instincts screamed at him to be cautious. He didn't trust this man. Too many people in this new world had learned to hide their true nature behind a friendly mask, only to reveal their true intentions when it was too late. But there was something about the stranger's tone that suggested he wasn't just another marauder or opportunistic scavenger. "What do you want?" Daniel asked, keeping his voice calm and measured, though his eyes were sharp, scanning for any signs of deception. The man chuckled softly, his eyes lingering on Elise. "I don't want trouble. I just need a place to rest for the night. There's a group of raiders not too far from here, and I've been running from them for a few days. I'm not in the mood for another fight. And I can tell you're not the kind to make unnecessary enemies." Daniel's gaze hardened. "How do you know about us?" The stranger's lips quirked into something like a smirk, though it was hard to tell. "Word gets around. People talk. I've heard stories. Not many survivors in these parts, but some know about the man with the undead wife and child." He motioned to Elise with a subtle nod. "It's not exactly a secret. Though, I'll admit, I didn't think I'd find you so soon." Daniel's hand tightened around his knife. He didn't like the way the man spoke. Too casual. Too knowing. But there was no immediate threat. And the mention of raiders made Daniel hesitate. They had been lucky so far, keeping out of the sight of such groups, but Daniel wasn't naive enough to think they were safe forever. If this man knew about them, others could too. "We don't have room for anyone else," Daniel said firmly, though the words felt hollow. It wasn't just about space. It was about the danger. Every new person, every new connection, brought a risk. Daniel had learned that the hard way. The stranger didn't seem offended. In fact, he took a step back, his gaze softening ever so slightly. I get it. Trust is hard to come by these days. I'm not looking for charity. Just shelter for the night. If you help me, I'll make myself useful, scout the area for any raiders, keep watch, whatever you need. In the morning, I'll be on my way. Daniel's mind raced. He didn't want to let this man in. Every instinct told him that this was a bad idea. But the stranger wasn't giving him much choice. He could send him away, but that could risk leading the raiders straight to their doorstep. And Elise. Elise wasn't the only defense they had anymore. The world was getting more dangerous by the day, and as much as he hated to admit it, the prospect of having someone to help, even for a night, felt like a small lifeline. He turned to Elise, whose eyes had never left the stranger. Her gaze was unreadable, her posture tense, but she hadn't made a move to attack. She was waiting for him to decide. Elise always deferred to him now, she had to, for both their sakes. Daniel let out a long breath, his decision weighing heavily on him. All right. You can stay for the night. But I'll be watching you. And if you try anything. He didn't need to finish the threat. The stranger understood. The man nodded, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Fair enough. Thank you. You won't regret it. With that, the man stepped closer, lowering the machete slightly, a gesture of peace. But Daniel didn't drop his guard. He gestured for the stranger to follow him inside, keeping a few steps ahead. Elise trailed behind them, her unsettling presence casting a shadow over the situation. As they entered the house, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that this stranger had more to him than met the eye. He had been too calm, too composed in the face of something as strange and dangerous as Elise. The door closed behind them, sealing the family off from the rest of the world for the moment. But Daniel knew that peace was temporary. This stranger's arrival could either be a stroke of luck or the beginning of something far worse. As the stranger settled by the fire, Daniel kept his watchful eye on him, ever aware of the silent tension that had settled between them. Elise's growl had subsided, but her unnerving gaze never wavered. For now, they were safe. But Daniel couldn't ignore the thought that gnawed at him. How long would it be before the fragile peace they had built would crumble? And how many more strangers would come to test the limits of his family's fragile world? The night passed in strained silence, the only sound being the occasional crackle of the fire as it danced in the small hearth. Daniel sat on the far side of the room, his eyes fixed on the stranger who sat near the fire, sharpening his machete with a slow, methodical precision. Elise stood by the window, her eyes scanning the darkened world outside, her stiff posture a constant reminder of how close to the edge they were. Lucas had fallen asleep in the corner, his little body curled up under a blanket, blissfully unaware of the tension that clung to the room. Daniel couldn't help but look at his son, a pang of guilt twisting in his chest. He wished he could give Lucas the life he deserved, a life that wasn't marred by the constant threat of death and destruction. But in this world, hope was a luxury. Survival was the only thing that mattered. The stranger, whose name was Jonah, had settled into the corner, though he didn't seem entirely at ease. His sharp eyes occasionally flicked toward Daniel, but he never made a move to engage in conversation. It was as if he, too, recognized that words were useless in a world that had lost meaning. There was no point in pretending they were anything more than two survivors in a hostile, dying world. But that didn't make Daniel trust him anymore. Jonah's presence was a constant reminder that the world outside was full of dangers far worse than the undead. People were just as much a threat as the flesh-eaters, if not more so. He'd already proven that he knew about them, about Daniel's family. And that meant he had connections, information that could be either a blessing or a curse. Daniel didn't know which it was yet. Stay close to Lucas, Daniel murmured to Elise, though she hadn't moved from her spot. Her gaze was distant, almost as if she were listening to something only she could hear. He never got used to the way her senses had sharpened since the infection had taken hold of her. It was both a blessing and a curse. A wife and mother who had lost her humanity, but whose protective instincts remained intact. A protector, yes, but one whose every motion sent shivers down Daniel's spine. Elise's response was a low, guttural sound, like a purr, but it was more of a warning than comfort. She understood the gravity of the situation. They were vulnerable in a way they hadn't been before. This stranger, Jonah, had access to things that could be dangerous. And yet, despite her unsettling nature, Elise still stood as Daniel's partner. They were a family, even if the world had made their bond strange and broken. Jonah finally broke the silence, his voice cutting through the stillness of the room like a blade. "You're not like the others, are you?" His words weren't a question so much as a statement of fact. "You've adapted. You and your wife," he hesitated, the word thick on his tongue. "You've found a way to survive." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "We've found a way to live," he corrected, his tone sharp. "What's your point?" Jonah shrugged, the motion casual but calculated. "I've seen it all. The desperation, the violence, the people doing whatever it takes to survive. But you too," he glanced at Elise, then back at Daniel. "You've made something more out of this. You've kept what matters. That's rare." Daniel didn't respond at first. The air felt thick with unspoken words, heavy with the weight of shared experiences neither of them was willing to put into words just yet. Jonah wasn't wrong. They had managed to carve out something in this dying world. But it was fragile, so fragile. And no matter how much Daniel wanted to believe they were safe, he knew better. The world outside would never let them be at peace. "You think I don't know what this is about?" Jonah continued, his voice lowering. "You're not fooling me. You're scared. But you're also smart enough to realize that sticking together is the only way to stay alive in this mess." Daniel gripped the edge of the chair, fighting the urge to lunge at the stranger. Jonah was talking as if he understood their situation, as if he had been through the same horrors, the same choices. But Daniel knew better than to let anyone close enough to probe his vulnerabilities. Trust was a currency in this world, and it was one Daniel had long run out of. "We're not interested in forming alliances," Daniel said stiffly, his jaw tightening. "You'll leave in the morning. No harm, no foul. Just go." Jonah's eyes twinkled with something, amusement, or maybe something darker. He didn't seem offended by Daniel's words, only more intrigued. "You really think it's that simple? You think you can keep hiding from the world forever?" Daniel's chest tightened. It wasn't just about hiding. It was about protecting his family. And the longer Jonah stayed, the more that protection seemed to slip out of his control. It was one thing to fend off zombies. It was another to fend off the threat of another human being. Jonah's voice softened as he leaned forward slightly. "I know you're worried. I get it. But you've got to face facts. The world's not coming back. The raiders won't stop. The undead won't stop. And soon, you'll have to decide whether you want to keep fighting alone or whether you'll stand together with people who know how to survive." Daniel didn't respond immediately. Jonah's words hit closer to the truth than he was comfortable with. They were running out of time. The world was closing in on them. And while he wanted to believe that they could keep their little family safe, he knew that, eventually, the walls would come crashing down. The fire crackled softly, its warmth a fleeting comfort in the cold reality that surrounded them. Elise shifted her stance, still standing near the window, her eyes darting back and forth in that eerie way she had. Daniel's heart thudded in his chest as he tried to calm his racing thoughts. The decision he faced was larger than he realized. In the end, survival would require more than just two people. He looked at Jonah again, then glanced at Elise, who gave him a subtle nod. It was almost imperceptible, but he knew what it meant. She trusted him to make the call. And the call was becoming clearer. Whether he liked it or not, he would have to choose who to trust, and if Jonah was still here in the morning, that choice would have consequences. The first light of morning filtered through the cracks in the wooden walls, casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. The air inside the small house was thick with tension, the remnants of the uneasy silence from the night before still hanging over them. Jonah had slept near the fire, his eyes closed but his posture alert, as if he had never fully relaxed. Elise had remained vigilant, her strange, heightened senses always on edge. And Daniel. Daniel couldn't sleep at all. His mind churned with the implications of Jonah's words and the risks of keeping him around. The sound of Lucas stirring in the corner broke through the heavy silence. The boy rubbed his eyes and sat up, his small face confused for a moment as he tried to orient himself. When he spotted Daniel, a smile crept across his face, and his innocence cut through the weight of the situation like a knife. "Morning, Dad," Lucas whispered, his voice still thick with sleep. Daniel's heart softened as he looked at his son. This was why he fought, why he endured the brutal, horrifying world they lived in. Lucas was the reason he kept going, despite the exhaustion, the fear, the constant battle for survival. Every day, Daniel tried to give Lucas a sliver of the normalcy he once had, a home, a semblance of family, some sort of hope. But Daniel knew that hope was fragile. It was a thin thread, and the world outside threatened to tear it apart at any moment. He ruffled Lucas's hair gently, forcing a smile. "Morning, kiddo. You sleep okay?" Lucas nodded, though his gaze drifted to the stranger still sleeping by the fire. His expression was guarded, as if the presence of an unfamiliar person in their safe space didn't sit right with him. "We don't know him, right, Dad?" Lucas asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel's stomach tightened at the question. He had hoped Lucas wouldn't notice, but the boy had always been perceptive, even for his age. He had inherited his mother's sharp mind, a gift that both terrified and impressed Daniel. "No," Daniel replied, kneeling down to meet Lucas's eyes. "We don't. But he's staying for the night, just to be safe." "Do we have to trust him?" Lucas's voice carried an edge of concern. It was a question Daniel had asked himself more than once. "I don't know, buddy," Daniel answered softly. "We'll figure it out." Before Lucas could ask any more questions, Jonah stirred from his spot on the floor. His eyes flicked open, sharp and alert, scanning the room for a moment before landing on Daniel. There was a brief moment of silence, and then Jonah stretched, standing up in one fluid motion. "Good morning," Jonah said, his voice steady but laced with an underlying tension. "I take it we're leaving soon, then?" Daniel stood and stretched, glancing at Elise, who was already at the door, her gaze fixed on the horizon outside. It was as if she could sense something coming, though Daniel wasn't sure what that something was. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. "We'll be leaving soon," Daniel confirmed, his voice low but firm. He wasn't in the mood for small talk. "But before we go anywhere, I need to ask you something." Jonah raised an eyebrow, his face unreadable, but there was something calculating in his gaze. "Ask away," he said, a slight shrug in his shoulders. He wasn't in a rush, but Daniel could see the subtle tension in his posture. He was prepared for whatever came next. "You've been running from raiders," Daniel began, taking a step closer. "But I'm wondering, why haven't you stayed with other survivors? What makes us different?" Jonah's eyes flicked toward the fire for a moment, his expression unreadable. He took a deep breath before answering. "People are dangerous," Jonah said, his voice quiet but steady. "It's not the walkers that scare me anymore. It's the ones who still think they have control over this world." He glanced at Elise briefly. "It's the ones who would use her, use anyone they can, just to get ahead. I've seen it happen before." Daniel felt his chest tighten at Jonah's words. It was a truth they all knew too well. People in the New World weren't just selfish, they were ruthless. They would do anything for survival, even if it meant betraying anyone they could. Jonah's gaze shifted to Lucas, his eyes darkening as if he could sense the vulnerability in the child. "But you're right to be cautious," Jonah added, breaking the heavy silence. "You don't know me. And I don't know you. But we all know the rules now. Trust is earned." A tense silence filled the room as Jonah's words hung in the air. Daniel exchanged a quick glance with Elise, who still stood by the window, her shoulders tight as she scanned the surroundings. He could feel the weight of the decision bearing down on him. Jonah's offer of help wasn't without its own strings attached. Trust might be earned, but it could also be broken. Then, in a move that startled him, Jonah reached into his pack and pulled out a small, tattered map. He unfolded it carefully and spread it out on the table between them, his fingers tracing the worn edges. "I've been around these parts for a while now," he said, pointing to several marks on the map. "I know the safest routes to avoid the raiders. And I know where there are still resources, food, weapons, things you'll need to keep going. If you're willing to work together, I can show you." Daniel eyed the map carefully. Jonah's knowledge of the area could be useful, but it also raised questions. Why would a man like him offer that kind of help? What did he expect in return? As Daniel studied the map, Elise shifted beside him, her eyes lingering on Jonah. She didn't trust him. Daniel could feel it in the way she moved, tense and ready to spring into action if needed. Jonah watched them both, his expression neutral. "I'm not asking for your loyalty, Daniel. I'm asking for a chance. We're all running out of time. The world's getting smaller, and soon enough, none of us will have anywhere to hide." Daniel's mind raced. Every instinct told him to be careful. But the reality was that they couldn't survive on their own much longer. They needed help, at least for now. And Jonah's offer, though suspicious, might be their only chance at getting to safety. He looked at Lucas, still sitting quietly, and then at Elise. The decision was becoming clearer with each passing second. Jonah wasn't the only one who had to make a choice. Daniel did, too. "I'll think about it," Daniel said, folding the map back up. "But we leave in an hour. If you're coming with us, you follow our rules." Jonah smiled slightly, as though he knew he'd won at least part of the battle. "I'll be ready." As Daniel turned toward the door, his mind still buzzing with uncertainty, he couldn't shake the feeling that the choice he was about to make would change everything, for better or for worse. The hour passed in a blur of activity. Daniel's mind raced with the weight of his decision. They were preparing to leave, but the unease clung to him like a second skin. Jonah, for all his quiet confidence, was still an unknown. But they couldn't afford to keep their guard up forever. The world outside had already stripped them of so much: trust, safety, and any semblance of normalcy. If they were going to make it, they had to adapt. Elise had kept to herself, her eyes scanning the horizon beyond the windows. Daniel could feel her discomfort as much as he could feel his own. It was hard to trust someone like Jonah, but there was a part of him that recognized the harsh reality they were facing. They couldn't do it alone anymore. Not if they were going to survive. Lucas, on the other hand, was more curious than anything else. The boy was a natural observer, his wide eyes soaking up every detail, every shift in the air. He had always been more perceptive than Daniel gave him credit for. Lucas noticed the smallest things, the tension in Jonah's voice, the subtle shifts in Elise's movements, the way Daniel's jaw clenched when he made decisions he didn't like. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon when they finished packing. Their supplies were meager, but it would have to do. Daniel checked the weapons they'd gathered: knives, a makeshift spear, and a few handguns. They didn't have much, but they had enough to defend themselves for now. He double-checked the map Jonah had shown him, marking the best route to avoid known raider territories and other dangerous areas. Jonah had proven himself knowledgeable in that respect, but Daniel was still cautious. As they readied to leave, Jonah moved to the door, his hand resting on the handle. He turned to Elise and Lucas, then to Daniel. There was something almost calculating in his gaze, something that made Daniel's skin crawl. "You're making the right choice," Jonah said, his voice low but steady. "If you want to stay alive, you have to trust the right people. Trust me, Daniel. I won't let you down." The words felt hollow, like a promise that was too easily given. Daniel didn't respond immediately. He couldn't. He had to maintain control, keep his focus on the task ahead. The world outside was waiting, and it was far less forgiving than Jonah's promises. "We'll see," Daniel said simply, his tone flat. There was no room for sentiment, no room for false hope. Not anymore. Jonah opened the door, and a blast of cold morning air rushed in. The world beyond their shelter was as bleak as ever: gray skies, the lingering smell of decay, and the ever-present hum of distant groans from the undead. It was a reminder of what they were up against, and the stark reality that every step forward could be their last. Elise led the way, her movements fluid and instinctive as she stepped into the cold light. Daniel followed, keeping close to Lucas. The boy clung to his side, his small hand gripping Daniel's jacket tightly as if he could somehow anchor himself in the chaotic world around them. Jonah brought up the rear, his eyes scanning the surroundings, every rustling of the wind or creak of wood alerting him to potential threats. Daniel could see the way he moved, careful, calculated, but with a predator's alertness. It was hard to ignore the fact that Jonah had survived in a way that most others hadn't. It spoke of experience, of a kind of cold determination that Daniel had seen in very few people. The journey began quietly. The forest they had to cross was dense, the trees thick with branches that blocked out much of the light. The air smelled faintly of decay, a constant reminder of the world they now lived in. Birds, if you could call them that, flew overhead, their bodies too thin and their calls too harsh to be anything like the wildlife of the past. Every sound, every movement, made Daniel's muscles tense, his instincts on high alert. Jonah led them for a time, guiding them through the woods and along hidden paths that Daniel had never noticed before. His knowledge of the land seemed to be extensive, and Daniel had to admit that the man was skilled in navigating through the wilds. It wasn't just about avoiding the undead, it was about avoiding people too. Jonah knew how to stay out of sight, how to track movements, and how to disappear if the need arose. By midday, they reached a small, run-down cabin. It was the kind of place that once belonged to hunters or survivalists, isolated, crude, but functional. The door was broken in several places, but the inside was relatively intact. It was the kind of shelter they could use for a while, if they needed it. But it was also the kind of place that attracted attention, and Daniel wasn't sure how long they could stay there without drawing unwanted visitors. Jonah gave the place a cursory inspection before turning to them. "We'll rest here for a bit," he said, his tone oddly formal. "It's better to keep moving, but we've been at it for hours. You'll need a break." Elise immediately moved to the window, checking the surroundings. She was never fully at ease, always vigilant. Lucas, for his part, wandered around the cabin, exploring every nook and cranny. His curiosity was a constant source of tension for Daniel. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not for a second. As Daniel set down their packs and began to prepare a small meal, Jonah spoke again, this time in a more somber tone. "I wasn't always alone. I had a family too." The words hung in the air, a heavy confession, and Daniel's gaze shifted toward him, though he didn't respond immediately. Jonah wasn't offering this information out of kindness, he was testing the waters. Seeing if they would open up, if they would reveal their own vulnerabilities. Jonah looked away, a shadow passing over his face. The world changed too fast. We were never ready for it. No one was. There was something raw in Jonah's voice, something that Daniel hadn't expected. For a moment, he saw the man not as a threat, but as another victim of this broken world. They all were. In the end, they all shared the same fate, survival at any cost. But the question remained, could they trust Jonah with their lives? Could they trust him to protect them in this new, savage world? Elise returned to the group, her eyes narrowed, her hand resting on the knife at her belt. She knew the dangers better than anyone. And despite what Jonah had said, she had no intention of letting her guard down. Neither did Daniel. They weren't safe yet. Not by a long shot. The night descended quickly. The forest around them seemed to close in, the shadows growing longer as the world outside the cabin slipped into eerie silence. The wind picked up, rustling the trees with a sound like whispers. Elise stood near the window, her sharp eyes scanning the area, while Jonah took the far corner, leaning against the wall and keeping his own vigil. Daniel sat by the fire, watching Lucas as the boy played quietly with a small wooden figure he'd found in the corner of the cabin. For a moment, everything felt almost normal. Almost peaceful. But Daniel knew better than to get comfortable. Elise's voice broke through the quiet. "We need to talk about what comes next." She turned, her gaze meeting Daniel's as if she were already expecting the question that had been eating at him all day. Jonah looked up, his face impassive but his eyes alert, as if he were ready to answer any question thrown his way. Daniel nodded slowly, pushing himself up from the floor. The fire crackled, sending light dancing across the cabin's worn walls. He glanced at Lucas, who was still absorbed in his game, and then back at Jonah. There was something about the man that didn't sit right with him. Jonah had proven useful, sure. But every word from his mouth, every gesture, felt like a calculated move. "What's the plan?" Daniel asked, his voice steady but firm. "We can't just stay here. The dead are everywhere, and so are the people who would kill us just to take what little we've got left." Jonah straightened, his posture shifting into something more rigid, more controlled. "We move out at dawn," he said simply. "There's a safe zone, not far from here. I've been there before. They don't let many people in, but it's better than trying to survive in the open." Elisa's lips tightened at the mention of a safe zone. She had never been a fan of trusting others, especially after everything they had gone through. People, alive, undead, it didn't matter anymore, had a way of betraying others. She didn't voice her thoughts aloud, but Daniel could see the flicker of doubt in her eyes. "I'm not convinced," she muttered. "If there's a safe zone, why hasn't anyone else heard of it? Why is it so secret?" Jonah's expression remained neutral, though a flash of something, irritation, perhaps, passed through his gaze. "It's hidden, that's all. People don't want others to know about it. Some are willing to die to keep it that way." Daniel felt the weight of Jonah's words. They could very well be walking into a trap. But at the same time, they had no other choice. The world outside had nothing to offer them. No guarantees. No safety. It was a gamble, but it was one they had to take. "So, we're just supposed to trust you?" Elise asked, her voice dripping with suspicion. Jonah didn't flinch. He was too practiced for that. "I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to trust the situation. You want a place to survive, don't you?" Elise's grip tightened on the knife at her belt. "I want to survive, sure. But not by walking into a den of snakes." The tension in the room was palpable, as if they were all waiting for something, an answer, a sign, anything to push them in one direction or another. The sound of the wind outside howled louder, adding to the ominous feeling that had settled over them. But as much as Elise hated to admit it, she knew that they had no better option. They could keep running, keep hiding, but for how long? The undead were relentless, and the survivors they had encountered in the past were just as dangerous. A safe zone, if it existed, might be their best shot at finding some kind of stability. Daniel exhaled slowly, his thoughts swirling. "We leave at first light," he said, his voice unwavering. "But we stick together. We don't trust anyone out there. Not even if they promise us food or shelter." Jonah raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. "Fair enough," he said. "Just remember, if you want to survive, you can't do it alone. People are dangerous, but so are the dead. You'll need allies." Elise shot him a sharp look, but she didn't respond. Daniel could feel the weight of the decision resting on his shoulders. He couldn't afford to second-guess himself now. Whatever happened, they had to keep moving forward. They had to reach the safe zone, whether it was a trap or not. Because if they didn't, they'd end up out there, alone, hunted, and running out of time. As the night dragged on, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He could hear the wind picking up outside, the branches of trees creaking in the distance. Every now and then, the far-off growl of a walker reached his ears. But what unsettled him most was the fact that there was a stillness in the air, an eerie calm before the storm. It felt like the world itself was holding its breath. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows on the walls. Daniel couldn't help but wonder if he was making the right decision. Was he leading his family into danger? Or was this the best shot they had left at survival? There was no way to know for sure. He had to trust his instincts, even if they felt like they were betraying him. Elise moved to the window again, her eyes darting to the horizon. "Something's wrong," she muttered, her voice tense. "I can feel it." Daniel turned to look at her, his heart racing. What do you mean? She didn't answer immediately. Her gaze remained fixed on the outside world, her eyes narrowed as if searching for something, anything, out of place. Then, just as quickly, she spun around, her hand reaching for her knife. They're coming, she said, her voice sharp with urgency. We need to move. Now. Jonah stiffened at her words, his eyes flicking toward the door. Daniel felt the adrenaline hit him like a wave. This was it. The calm before the storm had ended. The danger was real now, and it was closing in fast. Get ready, Daniel said, his voice low but steady. We leave now. They gathered their things quickly, the weight of the decision heavy in the air. Jonah was already by the door, his hand resting on the handle as he gave them a final glance. His face was unreadable, but Daniel could see the tightness in his jaw. They had no time to waste. As they stepped into the night, the wind howled louder, and the distant groans of the undead grew closer. Their time was running out. You said. The night was thick with tension as Daniel and his family stepped outside the cabin. The world around them had turned from eerie silence to a chaotic rush of sounds, the wind, the distant growls of the undead, and the creaks of the forest settling. Every step forward felt like it could be their last. Daniel's instincts screamed at him to turn back, but the choice was already made. They couldn't stay here. They couldn't survive on the edge of the dying world any longer. Jonah led them through the woods, his movements fluid and practiced. Elise stayed close, her sharp eyes scanning every corner of the forest, every movement in the dark. Lucas clung to Daniel's side, his small hand clutching his father's jacket, as if he feared being left behind in the cold, unforgiving world. But Daniel couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the forest. It wasn't just the undead or the survivors lurking in the shadows. It was Jonah. The man had been too quiet, too controlled. He was the kind of person who kept his emotions hidden, but that didn't mean they weren't there. Daniel had learned long ago that people who appeared too calm in the face of danger were often the most dangerous. Jonah had proved himself useful, but trust was a currency that didn't come easy in a world like this. And yet, they had no choice. They had to keep moving forward. As they trekked deeper into the woods, the sound of the undead grew louder, the low growls and distant shuffling sending a chill through Daniel's spine. They were getting closer. The horde was out there, somewhere in the darkness. It was only a matter of time before they stumbled across the cabin and began to search for any sign of life. Jonah slowed down, signaling them to stop. His face was tense, his eyes scanning the horizon. Daniel's heart began to race. They were close, too close. He had always been able to feel when danger was near, but this felt different. We need to move faster, Jonah said, his voice low but urgent. The horde isn't far behind. Elisa's hand went to her knife again, her gaze sharp and alert. She wasn't afraid to fight. She had done it before. But Daniel saw the worry in her eyes. She was calculating the odds, weighing their options. If they kept going, they risked running right into the horde. If they turned back, they risked being surrounded. There was no easy answer. I'll go ahead, Jonah volunteered, his voice still steady. I'll scout the area and make sure we're not walking into a trap. Daniel nodded reluctantly. Be careful. Jonah didn't respond, only disappearing into the dark trees like a shadow. Daniel felt the emptiness of his absence almost immediately. There was something unsettling about Jonah's presence, but there was also a certain reliability in his actions. They had been relying on him for guidance, and now they were trusting him to keep them safe. But Daniel couldn't shake the thought that, deep down, Jonah had his own agenda. Elise stood beside him, her gaze still focused on the treeline. Do you trust him? She asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Daniel didn't answer right away. He couldn't lie to her. He wasn't sure. I don't know, he admitted finally. But we don't have a choice. If he's right about the safe zone, it could be our only chance. They fell into an uneasy silence as the minutes ticked by. Lucas fidgeted, his eyes wide with fear. Daniel bent down to reassure him, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder. "Hey, you're doing great," he said softly. "We'll get through this. We just have to stick together." Lucas nodded, though the worry in his eyes didn't fade. It was the same look Daniel had seen in his own reflection for months now, a look that said, "I'm not sure we're going to make it, but I'm going to try anyway." The sound of snapping branches broke the silence, and Daniel's heart skipped a beat. His eyes shot toward the source of the sound, every muscle in his body tensed for action. But it wasn't the undead. It was Jonah, returning from his scouting trip. He emerged from the trees, his face grim. "We need to move. Now." Daniel's pulse quickened. "What happened?" Jonah didn't hesitate. "There's a group of survivors nearby. They're armed, and they're already moving this way. We're not going to outrun them, and they won't hesitate to kill us if they catch us. We have to keep moving, away from here." Elisa's hand went to her knife once again, her face hardening. "How many?" Jonah's eyes narrowed. "At least 5. Maybe more. They're coming fast." Daniel made a snap decision. "We go north. There's an old highway that should lead us to a better route. We stay low and move quickly. No detours." Jonah nodded, his expression unreadable. "Right." They moved with urgency, the pace quickening as they put distance between themselves and the approaching group. Daniel's mind raced. If these survivors were as dangerous as Jonah suggested, they didn't have much time. The forest was thick, but it wasn't enough to hide them forever. They needed to find shelter, and fast. As they neared the edge of the woods, the sound of the horde grew louder, closer. The undead had started to converge on their path. Daniel could hear the growls now, the shuffle of decaying feet moving closer with every passing second. Jonah stopped, holding up a hand to signal them to halt. His eyes darted from side to side, and Daniel could see the tension in his posture. "We're not going to make it through this unscathed," he muttered. "They'll be on us any minute now." Daniel's heart hammered in his chest. There was no choice but to fight. No choice but to survive. "Get ready," Daniel ordered, his voice steady. "We fight our way through if we have to." Elise and Jonah drew their weapons, their movements precise and practiced. Daniel pulled his own gun from his belt, checking it one last time. They had no idea what they were about to face. But whatever it was, they would face it together. The undead were closing in, their guttural groans filling the air as they shuffled through the underbrush. The survivors were getting closer too, and the world had never felt more uncertain. This was it. The final decision. They could no longer run from their fate. They had to fight for it. They had to survive. As the first of the undead emerged from the trees, Daniel took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever came next. This was the end of one world, and the beginning of another.